Savannah, Georgia, October 1851. The ledger weighed more than it should have. Thomas Calder Rowe had handled books his entire adult life. Cotton tallies, rice inventories, shipping manifests thick with repetition and grease. He knew the difference between paper that was heavy with meaning and paper that was merely thick. This one was wrong. It sat open on his desk beneath the yellow light of a single oil lamp, its leather cover cracked like dried skin. The pages smelled faintly of mold and iron. Someone had rebound it recently. New stitching, careful work, but the paper inside was old, older than the date written on the title page. Rowe dipped his pen and resumed copying. October 14, received from Inland Transfer, 6 male, 4 female, assorted ages, suitable for field labor. Routine, safe, invisible. Then his eyes snagged on a line that should not have slowed him down. Female, age about 19, left wrist, marked. He paused. Not because scars were unusual. Rope burns, iron cuffs, broken skin healed wrong. Marks were expected. But something about the phrasing bothered him. Marked. Not scarred, not injured. Marked. As if someone had wanted the mark preserved. Rowe turned back a page. 2 weeks earlier. Female, age about 22. Left wrist, marked. Different shipment, different owner, same vague language. He told himself it was coincidence. The Low Country was full of ruined wrists. He turned another page. 3 months earlier. Female, age about 18. Left wrist, marked. Speaks little. Rowe's pen hovered. The age slid backward in time. That happens sometimes. Clerks estimated, owners lied, youth sold better. But the phrasing, marked. Same word, same placement, same hand. Rowe leaned closer, tracing the indentation left by the previous clerk. The pressure was heavy there, deliberate. Whoever had written it wanted the word to last. He felt a flicker of unease, quickly suppressed. Unease was indulgence. Unease had no place in a counting room. He kept copying. Rowe had been a clerk for 11 years. He was not cruel. That distinction mattered to him, though he knew it mattered to no one else. He did not beat people. He did not own them. He wrote what others told him to write. Ink was neutral. Paper did not scream. That was the lie that made his life possible. The shipping office overlooked the river where boats slid past like indifferent animals. Every day, people arrived bound and left bound, and the water swallowed the sound. Savannah was good at that, absorbing noise, laundering guilt through routine. Rowe had learned early never to look at faces. Names were safer, numbers safest of all. But once a pattern entered your sight, it did not leave easily. That afternoon, as the office emptied and the river darkened, Rowe pulled the ledger closer and began searching backward. He was careful, casual, the way a man looks for nothing in particular. He found it again, and again, and again. Always a female, always the left wrist, always the same vague description. Sometimes the age shifted upward, sometimes downward, sometimes the name changed entirely. Etta, Hannah, Millie, no name listed, female prime. Once, chillingly, female, age indeterminate, left wrist, ruined. Rowe closed the book. His heart was beating too fast. That was foolish. There were thousands of entries like this, thousands of lives reduced to margins and columns. Why this one? Because it moved. He opened a different ledger, Transfers Inland, scanned quickly. There it was. Transferred upriver, no resale authorized. No resale? That was rare. People were sold constantly. The market depended on circulation. No resale meant containment. Rowe's mouth went dry. He flipped forward. Returned from illness, keep separate. Another ledger, another hand. Special handling required. Another.
Status: missing. Missing. Not dead, not sold. Missing meant the books did not want to answer questions. Rowe leaned back, chair creaking. He stared at the ceiling, counting his breaths. This was none of his business. This was exactly the sort of thing clerks were not meant to see. He should close the book, lock the drawer, go home. Instead, he reached for scrap paper. Rowe was not brave, but he was precise. He began copying, not names, not dates, but phrases, the language that repeated. Special handling, no resale, transferred again, keep separate, status uncertain. He realized something slowly, unwillingly. The system did not erase people by killing them. It erased them by moving them. Movement broke witnesses. Movement fractured memory. Movement meant no single owner could be held responsible. If someone vanished completely, it invited inquiry. But if they were always elsewhere, then nowhere had to answer for them. Rowe's hand trembled as he wrote. This was not negligence. It was design. The ledger had not revealed a tragedy. It had revealed a mechanism. That night, Rowe dreamed of wrists. Not hands, just wrists. Pale and dark and scarred, extending from sleeves without bodies attached. Each bore the same ring of damage, as if something had been tightened and tightened until the flesh surrendered. When he woke, his bed sheets were damp with sweat. He dressed quickly and returned to the office before dawn. The ledger was where he left it, but the pages were no longer aligned. Someone had opened it. Rowe froze. The room smelled faintly different, tobacco maybe, or oil, a presence that had passed through and lingered. He turned the page slowly, his fingers numb. His notes were still there. But beside one entry, pressed into the paper so hard it nearly tore through, someone had added something. Not ink, pressure. 2 letters, carved by force. No. Rowe stared at it until the letters blurred. The system had noticed him, and it had answered.
October 1851. The letters no did not fade. Rowe tried blotting them, tried rubbing the page with cloth. The indentation remained. Paper fibers crushed, wounded. Even when the light shifted, even when he angled the book away from himself, the refusal stayed visible. Someone had been close enough to smell the ink drying on his notes. Someone had read what he had seen. That knowledge changed the room. Every creak of the floorboards sounded deliberate now. Every footstep outside the office door felt aimed. Rowe sat very still, listening to the river breathe through the open window. He understood the message clearly enough. Not stop. Never start. The system did not threaten, it corrected. Rowe did what frightened men have always done. He returned to routine. He copied manifests, he checked sums, he spoke politely. He did not look at wrists. For 3 days, nothing happened. That was worse. On the 4th day, the first correction arrived. It was subtle, a new ledger delivered without comment. Same format, same binding, but the paper was fresh, the ink uniform. When Rowe compared entries, he realized entire months had been recopied. Cleaned. The woman with the marked wrist still appeared, but differently. No repetitions, no notes about separation, no mention of illness or special handling. Just female, age 21, sound. Sound. Rowe's stomach twisted. The system was not angry. It was embarrassed. He began noticing absences. A fellow clerk, Samuel Price, did not arrive one morning. Price had been there longer than Rowe, quiet, meticulous, unmarried. No explanation was given. By the afternoon, Price's desk was cleared, his ledgers removed. Another clerk took his place without introduction. Rowe asked no questions. But that night, he returned to his scraps. He had learned something crucial. When the system rewrote itself, it left seams. The new ledgers did not quite match the old ones. Dates overlapped wrong, ages aligned too neatly. The messiness of life had been replaced by something smoother and less true. He began marking the seams. Not openly, never openly. A dot beneath a letter, a dash too long, a numeral shaped differently. Tiny disruptions, enough to signal recognition to anyone who knew how to look. That was when the second correction came. It arrived in the form of a body. They found him near the river, caught between pilings like discarded rope. A man from the docks, name unknown, no visible wounds. Drowned, the papers said. Rowe recognized him anyway. The man had come to the office weeks earlier to argue a tally. He'd had a scar around his left wrist, older than most. Not fresh rope, iron maybe, long-term restraint. Rowe had noticed it then, without knowing why. Now the wrist was swollen, pale, the skin split where water had softened it. The ring of damage was unmistakable. The river returned what the system had failed to erase cleanly. The body was removed quickly. The office resumed work within the hour. No one spoke of it. That was the rule. But that night, Rowe added a new phrase to his list. Bodies appear when movement fails. He understood now. The ledger was not recording deaths, it was recording risk. People were moved when they became dangerous, not physically, but informationally. They remembered routes, names, places where people went and did not return. They remembered patterns. Memory was the contagion, and the woman with the marked wrist, whoever she was, had survived long enough to see too much. That was why she had not been killed. Killing was loud. Killing invited inquiry. But movement was administrative. Movement looked like work. Rowe made a mistake. He followed a transfer. It was nothing dramatic, a simple note. Special inland reassignment, deliver by night. He traced the route through 3 ledgers, then 4, then 5. Each handoff shortened the paper trail. Names dropped out, descriptions thinned. By the 5th transfer, the entry read only, female, delivered. Delivered where? To whom? For what? The absence felt deliberate. Rowe closed the book slowly. This was not an error. This was a terminus. He did not go home that night. He walked. Past the edge of town, past the last houses where lamps burned, into the roads that fed the plantations. He followed the direction the paper suggested, not because he expected to find her, but because he needed to understand what kind of place required this much silence. By dawn, he reached land that did not advertise itself. No signposts, no overseer's house in sight, just low buildings pressed into damp ground, as if ashamed of existing. A man stopped him before he reached the gate. "You're lost," the man said. Rowe looked at him carefully. Clean boots, no insignia, not plantation labor. "I'm a clerk, following a delivery." The man smiled without warmth. "No deliveries come here, only arrivals." Rowe felt something settle cold in his chest. "And departures?" The man's smile did not change. Not on paper. Rowe returned to Savannah shaken. He had seen enough. The ledger had shown him the outline of a place that existed to absorb people who could not be allowed to remain visible, but could not be allowed to die loudly either. A place where memory went to be stalled, contained. He did not sleep. The next morning, a letter waited on his desk. No seal, no signature. Just a sentence written in a precise hand. "You are excellent at your work. Do not ruin that." Rowe folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the ledger, right beside the crushed no. 2 refusals now. One from the system, one forming quietly inside him. That evening,
He did something irreversible. He copied the list. Not names, not places, movements, routes that repeated too often, transfers that happened only at night, words that meant disappearance without ever saying it. He did not know what he would do with it yet, only that once you see how people are erased without being killed, you cannot unknow it. And the ledger had already decided he was dangerous.
November 1851. The woman was not where the ledger said she should be. Thomas Calder Rowe discovered this on a gray morning when the river lay flat as beaten tin and the docks smelled of rot. He had followed the route again, quietly, carefully, this time not with his feet, but with his pen. Night delivery. Inland reassignment. No resale. Delivered. Delivered was supposed to end the question, but Rowe had learned that endings were the most suspicious part of any record. He requested the receiving ledger under the pretense of auditing weights. The clerk who handed it to him did not meet his eyes. That, too, was becoming familiar. Rowe turned the pages. No corresponding entry. He checked the index. Nothing. Cross-referenced by date, by volume, by the owner whose name appeared like a watermark throughout the trail. Still nothing. The woman, Etta, Hannah, Millie, female, had been delivered into a blank. The system had not lost her. It had refused to acknowledge her presence. Rowe closed the book slowly, his hands steady despite the cold crawling up his spine. This was new. He learned the truth by accident. A cart broke an axle near the warehouse gates that afternoon, spilling crates across the cobbles. Men swore. A foreman shouted. In the confusion, Rowe heard a voice he did not expect to hear at all. Soft, controlled, close. "You write slow," the voice said. Rowe turned. She stood a few paces away, a basket balanced at her hip as if she belonged to the ordinary world. Plain dress, headscarf pulled low. Nothing remarkable, until he noticed her left sleeve, worn thin, rolled just enough to reveal it. The wrist. The ring of pale, damaged flesh, healed wrong. Not fresh, not new. A mark that had survived movement. Rowe's breath left him in a shallow rush. "You copy like you want the words to stay put," she continued calmly, watching his face. "That makes you dangerous." He said nothing. She tilted her head slightly, studying, measuring. "They tried to put me where paper couldn't follow," she said, "but paper always leaks." Rowe swallowed. "You're—" She shook her head once, a warning. "Names don't matter. That's the first thing they take." A man shouted from behind her. She turned away at once, the basket shifting, the moment closing as cleanly as it had opened. But before she moved, she added quietly, "They're correcting you next." Then she was gone. Rowe did not move for a long time. When he finally did, it was to sit down very carefully, as if gravity itself had become unreliable. She was alive, not contained, not broken, working in plain sight, which meant the system had failed or adapted. He understood then what delivered really meant. Not imprisoned, deployed. The system did not always remove dangerous people. Sometimes it embedded them, placed them where they would be seen as harmless, as background, as labor too small to notice. A woman carrying baskets, a cook, a washer, a cleaner. People who moved everywhere and belonged nowhere. People who heard everything. That night, Rowe wrote until his fingers cramped. He mapped what he now understood to be a second layer of erasure, one more elegant than disappearance. When someone could not be erased without creating noise, they were flattened, reduced.
turned into a moving surface no one bothered to examine closely. But the scar remained, because bodies remember what paper denies. The next correction came swiftly. Rowe was summoned to a private office he had never entered before. The walls were bare, the desk immaculate. A man sat behind it whose face Rowe recognized only from signatures. Mr. Calder. You've been exemplary, consistent, attentive, careful. Rowe nodded once. Careful, Calder repeated. That can be a strength, or it can become misapplied. Silence stretched. You've noticed anomalies, inconsistencies. That's commendable. But order serves curiosity. And if order is wrong? Rowe asked before he could stop himself. Calder regarded him with mild interest. Order is not right or wrong. It is necessary. Rowe felt the weight of that word press down on him. You will be reassigned, Calder said, smiling faintly. A different office, less strain. Reassigned. The word landed like a blade set gently on skin. Rowe understood its meaning now. Movement. Correction. You should be grateful, Calder added. Most people are corrected more abruptly. Rowe stood when dismissed. He did not bow. He did not argue. But as he reached the door, Calder spoke again. The woman you think you saw, he said, she does not exist in any meaningful way. Rowe turned back slowly. That, Calder said pleasantly, is how the system survives. Rowe did not go to the new office. Instead, he walked until the city thinned and the land grew wet. He found her where she said she would be, where paper leaked. By the river bend, near a cluster of women scrubbing clothes. No guards, no chains, just proximity. She did not look surprised to see him. You told you to move, she said. Yes. And you didn't? No. She nodded. Approval, maybe, or recognition. They think movement erases us, she said, but it teaches us their paths. How many of you? Rowe asked. Enough, more than they're comfortable with. She looked at his satchel. You're carrying the wrong kind of book, she said gently. Ledgers tell them what they want to hear. What do you use? He asked. She tapped her temple. And each other. Rowe felt something in his chest break, not violently, but decisively. The system had taught him how to write. She had taught him how to remember. Together, that made him unmanageable. That night, the ledger Rowe had feared for so long ceased to be evidence. It became a weapon. And the woman with the marked wrist, who would never again stay where the paper put her, began teaching him the one thing the system could not survive: how to let memory move faster than authority.
Winter, 1851. The fires did not begin all at once. That was how Rowe knew they were intentional. Accidents bloom, panic spreads, flames jump greedily. But these fires were precise, small, contained, surgical. A record shed near Augusta lost only its interior shelves. A warehouse in Beaufort burned inward, collapsing on ledgers no one had touched in years while leaving the surrounding structures intact. In Savannah, a clerk's office smoldered just long enough to ruin ink, not wood. Each incident received the same explanation: lamp tipped, chimney fault, lightning strike. Calder signed off on every report. Terminate the record. The system had done this before. It had learned long ago that paper was easier to destroy than people. Burn the trail, and the past dissolved into rumor. Rumor could be dismissed. Rumor could be managed. What Calder did not understand, what he could not afford to understand, was that the record no longer lived in the books. It lived in bodies. Rowe felt the change even before he heard of the fires. The language shifted again. Ledgers grew thinner. Dates disappeared. Descriptions flattened into sameness. The system was starving itself of memory to avoid contradiction. But hunger has consequences. A shipment arrived with too many people for the manifest. Another arrived short, and no one could explain who was missing. A man appeared twice under different names, 3 weeks apart. Clerks noticed. Not all of them. Just enough. Because once you learn what to look for, you cannot unknow it. Roe was moved 3 times in 2 weeks. Each transfer shorter than the last, each destination less permanent. The system was shedding certainty, defaulting to instinct. Movement, always movement. But now, movement betrayed it. Every handoff introduced another witness. Every delay allowed another question to form before the wagon rolled again. They had taught people how to move too well. The woman with the marked wrist felt the shift as well. She said quietly to a group gathered near a tidal inlet where the water swallowed sound. "They're afraid," she said quietly, to a group gathered near a tidal inlet where the water swallowed sound. "Death is simple," she said. "What they're afraid of is comparison." She began teaching the final lesson. Not names, not routes. Questions. Why does the same phrase appear everywhere? Why are some people moved only at night? Why does missing never mean dead? You didn't need answers. You just needed enough people asking the same thing. Calder felt it in the numbers. Profit faltered. Claims contradicted each other. Buyers complained quietly that goods arrived altered. Altered meant resistant. Resistant meant aware. Aware meant contagious. He convened a closed meeting in Charleston. No minutes, no copies. Men leaned close, speaking in murmurs that carried more fear than outrage. "We end this," someone said. "How?" another asked. Calder did not answer immediately. Because for the first time, there was no clean solution. Kill her, and she becomes a story. Release her, and she speaks. Move her, and she connects more people. Containment had failed. Erasure had failed. The record no longer mattered. Roe understood what was coming when the wagon stopped at a crossroads that had no name. They did not bind him. They did not threaten him. They simply told him he would not be writing anymore. "You'll be comfortable. Quiet," the man said. Roe nodded. He had expected this. What the system did not expect was that comfort no longer frightened him. Because while they had been burning books, others had been copying patterns. Not perfectly. Not completely. Just enough. The final fire burned a courthouse archive to the ground. Years of records vanished overnight. Calder watched the smoke rise from a distance and felt, for the first time in his life, uncertainty harden into something like fear. The past was gone, and the questions remained. That was when he understood the mistake. Records could be destroyed. Memory could not, once it learned how to move. That night, in places far apart and unconnected on any map, people told the same small story in different ways. About a woman who could not be erased. About a clerk who asked why movement was always the answer. About a system that relied on silence until silence broke. No one told the whole thing. They didn't need to. Because the machine had taught them how disappearance worked. And now they were teaching each other how to see it.
Early spring, 1850, they caught her at a place where 3 roads crossed and none of them carried names. Thought there was no chase. That was deliberate. Men stepped from a wagon with folded papers and calm voices. No weapons drawn, no shouting. The tone was administrative, almost courteous, the voice of a system that believed it still owned the ending. "You're requested," one of them said. She looked at him, then at the road behind her, then at the trees. For a moment, just a moment, she considered vanishing the old way, slipping into the wet ground, becoming rumor again. Then she nodded. Compliance, she had learned, was sometimes the sharpest blade. They took her north. Not downriver, not inland, north where the system believed distance itself would dilute memory. Each transfer came with new papers, thinner each time, names changed, ages blurred, descriptions shrank, but the wrist remained. It always did. At a station outside Wilmington, a clerk paused mid-entry, staring at the scar. He said nothing, but his pen hesitated long enough for the escort to notice. That hesitation hollowed them. She was delivered to a house that did not admit what it was, not a jail, not a plantation, not a hospital, just a property held under a trust that did not exist long enough to be questioned, staffed by men who rotated often and remembered nothing when asked. The room they placed her in was clean, whitewashed, bare, a bed, a table, a window that did not open, containment without spectacle. They believed this would starve her. They misunderstood what fed her. The interrogations were quiet. No accusations, no violence. Just questions that circled the same point again and again, as if wearing her down would cause her to forget. What did you see? Who did you speak to? Where did you learn these things? She answered selectively, truthfully, in fragments. I saw people moved until no one could remember them whole. I spoke to those who noticed. I learned by surviving. The man across from her stopped writing. You understand, he said carefully, that memory is unreliable. She smiled. Only when it's alone. Calder arrived 3 days later. He did not introduce himself. He did not need to. You've caused inconvenience, he said, standing rather than sitting. That's not the same as change. She regarded him calmly. Inconvenience is how change begins. He ignored that. You are one person, Calder said. A single body. A manageable problem. She tilted her head slightly. That's what you told yourselves before. Calder's jaw tightened. You will stay here, he said. You will be comfortable. You will be forgotten. She met his eyes steadily. You don't forget people, she said. You scatter them. And this time, Calder replied, there will be no scattering. She leaned back against the wall, the chain at her wrist clinking softly, not tight, not painful, just present enough to be felt. That's how I know you're afraid, she said, while she was contained. Memory moved. Rose fragments had already escaped his hands. They traveled disguised as routine, as bookkeeping advice, as questions posed gently at the edge of conversation. Why does this rule repeat? Why does this phrase appear everywhere? Why do some people never stay long? The system tried to answer by accelerating. That only widened the cracks. A shipment listed 20 names, delivered 19 bodies. A plantation received workers already known there under different names. A courthouse clerk refused to file a missing entry without corroboration. Small things. Fatal things. In the holding house. A guard spoke out of turn. They're asking about Red Hollow again. He muttered, more to himself than to her. She looked up sharply. Where? She asked. He said nothing more, but his silence was enough. Red Hollow did not exist anymore, but memory of it did, and memory had learned how to surface without permission. Calder read the first pamphlet 2 weeks later. No accusations, no names, just questions, ranged with unsettling precision. Why are some people moved repeatedly? Why do records contradict themselves? Who decides when someone disappears? He recognized the structure immediately. Clerical. Measure. Devastating. He ordered the pamphlets seized. They vanished. More appeared. The mistake the system made, its final one, was believing that truth needed a single mouth to speak. From. When Calder ordered or transferred again, he thought movement would dilute her influence. Instead, it multiplied it. Every stop added a witness. Every delay allowed recognition. Every risk seen confirmed a pattern someone else already suspected. By the time she reached Philadelphia under a name that was not hers, the city had already begun telling her story without her. She stepped into the street. Unguarded, they let her. They thought the crowd would swallow her whole. Cities don't erase memory. They amplify it. That night, Calder sat alone at his desk and understood something he had spent his life avoiding. The system had not been defeated. It had been recognized, and recognition is irreversible. Because once people learn how disappearance works, they stop accepting it as normal. And once forgetting ends, there is no quiet way to restore control. Philadelphia, summer 1850. To the city did not ask her who she was. That was its mistake. Philadelphia swallowed people, everyday runaways, laborers, widows, men, who changed their names as easily as coats, noise layered over noise until individual stories blurred. Calder had counted on that. He believed scale would do what violence no longer could. He believed the city would finish what the system could not. Instead, it connected things. She took a room in a boarding house near the river, the kind meant for those who stayed briefly and left no impressions behind. She paid in cash she had no business possessing. No one asked where it came from. On her first morning, she walked. Not searching, not hiding. Listening. Cities speak differently than plantations. Information traveled sideways here through printers, dockworkers, preachers, seamstresses, through pauses in conversation and sentences left unfinished. By the end of the week, she knew something Calder did not. They were already telling her story. Not her, not a woman with a scar and too many names. The pattern. People spoke of missing laborers who appeared again miles away, of children whose names shifted like smoke, of ledgers that never quite matched the bodies they claimed to represent. No one needed her to explain. They needed confirmation. She gave it sparingly. A word here, a nod there, a wrist uncovered briefly, then hidden again. Recognition did the rest. A printer noticed the scar and remembered a question from years earlier. A preacher heard a phrase repeated and realized he had heard it before somewhere else. From someone else. A dockworker compared to manifests and felt his stomach drop. Memory began doing what Calder had spent his life preventing. It compared itself. The system responded the only way it still could. It spoke. Pamphlets appeared official-looking, measured, reassuring. They acknowledged irregularities. They blamed clerical error. They promised reform. The language was familiar to anyone who had ever worked near power. Control the version. Delay the reckoning. Let people tire of asking. Calder supervised every word. We concede nothing, he instructed. We explain everything. But explanation is a dangerous substitute for silence, because explanation invites scrutiny. Rowe read one of the pamphlets weeks later in a town he had no reason to be in. He recognized the voice immediately. It sounds reasonable, someone nearby said. Rowe nodded. That's how you know it's a lie. What do you mean? Rowe pointed to a line about isolated incidents. They wouldn't need that phrase, he said quietly, if the incidents were truly isolated. The man frowned. A seed. That was all it took. Calder felt the failure before he saw it. The pamphlets did not calm people. They sharpened them. Every reassurance was met with a comparison. Every denial triggered someone else's memory. The system had spent decades teaching people to read between the lines. Now they were doing it out loud. A judge asked why records contradicted themselves. A clerk refused to certify manifests without corroboration. A newspaper printed a question it did not yet know how to answer. The system had made itself visible. Calder requested one final meeting with her. She agreed. They sat across from each other in a rented room that pretended to be neutral ground. You could have stayed quiet, Calder said. You could have survived. I did survive, she replied. That's the problem. You don't understand what you're risking, he said. Systems don't collapse. They adapt. She smiled faintly. I know. That's why this matters. You think this ends us, Calder said. No, she said gently. I think it ends your certainty. He leaned forward. And what replaces it? She considered him for a long moment. Witnesses, she said. Calder resigned within the month. Not publicly, not in disgrace. His name simply stopped appearing where it used to. Someone else took his place. Someone younger. Someone who believed the language would work again. It didn't. Because language had lost its monopoly, the woman left Philadelphia. Quietly. Not because she was afraid, but because she was no longer necessary. Memory had learned how to speak without her. Roe heard the last confirmed report of her years later. A market square. A conversation cut short, a sleeve rolled back, briefly, as if by accident. Then nothing. No record of her death, no proof of her survival, which was fitting. She had never been meant to be resolved. What remained were interruptions, a clerk who hesitated, a ledger that refused to align, a question asked twice. The system continued. It always does, but to no longer a quietly, and that was enough. 1853 to 1860, there was no moment anyone could point to and say, "This is when it broke," that disappointed people who wanted endings. What followed instead was irritation, persistent, unclean, impossible to scrub away, like grit in a joint, like a sound you could not locate but could not ignore. The system still functioned. People were still bought, sold, transferred, reassigned. Paper still moved. Authority still spoke with confidence. But that spoke louder now, and louder is never stronger. Thomas Calder Roe lived under 3 names after Philadelphia, not because he was hiding but because names had become tools, and he had learned how tools worked. He clerked briefly in Maryland, then in a river town that barely appeared on maps. He never stayed long enough to teach, long enough to see. He did not distribute documents, he distributed habits. Read backward, he told one young clerk. Compare dates before trusting sums, he told another. Notice what language evolves, he said to a third. They thought he was meticulous. They did not realize he was teaching them how to see. The system tried to normalize disruption. It introduced oversight committees. It formalized review processes. It invented language that sounded like accountability. But every new layer added friction. Every new procedure introduced delay. Delay was fatal to a system that depended on motion. People began to notice how often temporary measures became permanent, how often review meant relocation, how often clarification meant disappearance. They did not protest. They hesitated, and hesitation spread. The woman with the scar had become something else entirely. She no longer needed to speak. She appeared in fragment stories without origins, patterns without a face. Some claimed she had never existed. Others insisted she had been many people, a composite stitched together by guilt and rumor. Both were right. Because she had become function, not figure, she was what happened when memory refused to remain private. In one courthouse, a ledger was found with a year missing. No fire, no theft, just absence. In another, a clerk had annotated an inventory with a question mark so small it went unnoticed for months until someone else added another beside it. Soon, the margin spoke more loudly than the entries. The system adapted, of course. It always does. It replaced old phrases with new ones. It refined its euphemisms. It built safeguards that looked like protection and functioned like distance. It learned to absorb criticism without changing behavior, but it never regained quiet. The silence it relied on had been punctured, and silence, once breached, does not heal cleanly. Roe stopped writing entirely sometime in the late 1850s, not because the work was finished but because it no longer needed him. He watched from a distance as others took up the practice instinctively, as young clerks paused over manifests that felt wrong, as overseers learned that explanations now require witnesses. He had outlived his usefulness. That was victory enough. The system survived. That mattered, because destruction would have been too clean, too easy to dismiss as anomaly. Survival meant adaptation, and adaptation meant exposure. The machine learned fear of comparison, fear of witnesses, fear of memory moving without permission. Fear made it clumsy. No monument marked the change. No declaration named it, but the sound of it persisted. In the pause before a signature, in the breath drawn before writing missing, in the question asked one time to many. The machine still ate people. It just could not do it quietly anymore. Long after no one remembered Thomas Calder Roe as a person. That was not an accident. People, like him, were designed to dissolve, to leave behind habits rather than names, disruptions rather than monuments. He became what the system could not catalog, influence without ownership. Years later, a bundle of papers would surface in a wall during a renovation, notes without dates, lists without titles, marginal marks that made no sense on their own. Historians would argue over provenance, authenticity, intent. They would miss the point. The papers were not meant to survive as evidence. They were meant to survive as instructions. By the time the century turned, the system wore a new face. No ledgers bound in leather, no shipping manifests listing people as freight, no auctions conducted in daylight with numbers read aloud. Instead, there were registries, case files, assessments, committees, all cleaner, all quieter, still movement, still reassignment, still disappearance, bade administrative. The language change, unfit, relocated, lost to follow-up, non-compliant, words that did the same work without sounding like it, and the same flow remained. Somewhere, someone paused. That pause looked like nothing. A clerk hesitating before closing a file. A caseworker noticing a pattern no one had named. An auditor wondering why certain people moved so often. The feeling came first. The recognition followed. Then the question, why is movement always the solution? That question did not belong to the 1800s. It belonged everywhere the system went. The woman with the scar appeared again and again, long after she should have vanished entirely, not as a person, as a shape. In oral histories that never agreed on details, in marginalia scholars could not trace, in stories told by people who swore they had seen her or someone like her, a woman who remembered too well, a woman who moved without being erased, a woman the system could not digest. They argued over whether she was real. They never asked why the story kept returning. The system learned to live with noise. It had to, but noise changed it, forced it to justify, forced it to explain, forced it to slow. And slowing is how machines lose their appetite. Not all at once, just enough. The most dangerous thing that ever happened to the system was not exposure. Exposure can be managed. The most dangerous thing was comparison. When people began to say, quietly, "This happened to me too," that sentence did not exist in any ledger. It could not be burned. It could not be reassigned. It could not be marked missing. In the end, there was no final document. No closing entry. No verdict. There were only interruptions, a question that refused to stay buried, a hesitation that broke momentum, a memory that learned it did not have to be alone. That was the inheritance. Not justice. Not closure. Awareness. Somewhere, right now, a record is being written that does not quite align with reality. Someone notices, their pen pauses. That pause matters, because the system that once ate people quietly was taught something it could never unlearn, that memory moves, that witnesses multiply, that silence is fragile, and that even the most carefully engineered disappearance leaves behind a shape, visible to anyone who has learned how to look. No date recorded ledger did not survive. That is the version most people accept. It burned with the others lost to damp, fire, neglect, or deliberate forgetting. Its cover cracked, its pages fed to smoke, its ink reduced to ash that settled quietly into the floors of buildings that would later swear they had never held such things. That is the clean ending. It is also wrong, because ledgers do not die the way people do. They persist as habits. Long after the physical book vanished, its structure remained: columns, categories, margins meant for silence. The world kept arranging human lives into manageable units. It kept measuring worth by productivity, inconvenience by cost, disappearance by how little disruption it caused. The language evolved. So did the confidence, but the shape stayed the same. Somewhere always, somewhere a person opened a record and felt unease before they could explain why. A phrase felt too smooth, a transfer to frequent, a justification, the practice. They did not know Thomas Calder O's name. They did not know the woman with the scar. They did not need to. The ledger had taught them what to notice. Historians would later debate whether the system had been designed to erase people or whether it had simply evolved that way. They would argue about intent, about culpability, about whether cruelty required awareness to count as cruelty. The ledger had already answered that question. Intent was irrelevant, participation was enough. The woman with the scar was never found in any graveyard. That troubled people who wanted proof. But she had never belonged to that kind of ending. She existed wherever someone refused to let movement replace explanation. Wherever a record was interrogated instead of accepted. Wherever a disappearance was treated as a question rather than a conclusion. She existed in interruption. Thomas Calder Rowe's final act was not writing. It was stopping. Stopping when stopping was dangerous. Stopping when stopping broke the flow. Stopping when stopping forced others to notice the gap. That was the quietest rebellion the ledger ever recorded. And the loudest. Today, systems still eat people quietly. They still rely on speed. They still reward silence. They still move bodies faster than accountability can follow. But they do so with an old wound they cannot heal. The knowledge that someone might be paying attention. That someone might compare notes. That someone might remember out loud. The ledger revealed how people were erased without being killed. It did not end that practice. It did something more durable. It made erasure recognizable. And once a thing is recognizable, they can never again pretend to be natural. Somewhere, right now, a page is being turned. Someone pauses, not because they are brave, not because they are righteous, but because something does not align. That pause is the echo of the ledger. That pause is the story continuing. Because the system was never undone. It was understood. And understanding is the one thing it was never built to survive.